When people first encounter Linux, especially if they come from years of using Windows or macOS, the most common reaction is confusion. Menus feel unfamiliar, software is installed in strange ways, files live in unexpected places, and the system seems to demand more thought from the user. This reaction often leads to the belief that Linux is simply harder or less user-friendly. In reality, Linux is not trying to be Windows or macOS at all. It is built on a fundamentally different philosophy, one that shapes every design decision, from how the system boots to how applications are distributed. To understand why Linux thinks differently, you have to understand that it was never designed primarily as a consumer desktop operating system. It grew out of a culture of engineers, researchers, and system administrators who valued control, transparency, and flexibility over visual polish and immediate convenience. Windows and macOS both evolved with the average end user in mind. Windows was designed to run on as many consumer PCs as possible, hiding complexity behind graphical interfaces so that non-technical users could get work done without needing to understand what was happening underneath. macOS, built on top of Unix foundations but heavily customized by Apple, focuses on controlled simplicity. Apple decides how the system should work, what users are allowed to change, and how software should be distributed. The result is a polished, predictable experience where most decisions are already made for you. Linux takes the opposite approach. It assumes that the user, or at least the system administrator, wants to make those decisions themselves. One of the clearest examples of this difference is how Linux views ownership and control of the system. On Windows and Mac OS, the operating system often feels like a product you are borrowing. Certain parts of the system are locked away, updates are pushed automatically, and customization is limited to what the vendor considers safe. On Linux, the system belongs to you. Every configuration file is accessible. Almost every behavior can be changed. This freedom can feel overwhelming, but it is intentional. Linux assumes that if you are using it, you want to understand it, or at least have the option to understand it. This mindset comes from Unix traditions, where operating systems were tools for professionals who needed reliability and precision rather than simplicity. Another major difference lies in how Linux handles software. Windows users are accustomed to downloading executable files from websites, running installers, clicking through setup wizards, and hoping nothing unwanted gets installed along the way. Mac OS users often drag applications into a folder or install them through the App Store, trusting Apple's curation. Linux, by contrast, relies heavily on package managers and centralized repositories. This reflects a deeper philosophical belief. Software should come from trusted sources, be verified, and integrate cleanly with the rest of the system. Instead of each application managing its own updates and dependencies, the system manages them as a whole. This reduces conflicts and improves stability, but it requires users to think in terms of the system as an ecosystem rather than a collection of independent apps. The Linux file system also reveals how differently it thinks. On Windows, drives are separate entities, each with its own letter, and files are often organized around user convenience. On Mac OS, the file system is hidden behind a polished interface, with most users rarely venturing beyond their home folder. Linux presents a single unified file system tree where everything has a specific purpose. Configuration files live in predictable locations, system binaries are separated from user applications, and temporary data is treated differently from permanent data. This structure is logical from a system design perspective, but it assumes the user is willing to learn the logic. Linux does not prioritize immediate familiarity. It prioritizes long-term consistency. Security is another area where Linux's mindset diverges sharply. Windows and Mac OS try to protect users from themselves by limiting access and prompting for permission only when necessary. Linux assumes that users understand the power they hold. The concept of root access is central, and the system makes a clear distinction between regular users and administrative control. This separation is strict and visible. Rather than hiding dangerous operations, Linux exposes them but requires explicit intent. This design reduces accidental damage and improves security, but it demands awareness. Linux trusts the user more, but with that trust comes responsibility. Customization further highlights Linux's philosophy. On Windows and Mac OS, customization exists but within boundaries. You can change themes, wallpapers, and some behaviors, but the core experience remains largely the same. Linux treats customization as a fundamental feature. You can change your desktop environment entirely, swap out core components, and even remove the graphical interface altogether. This modularity reflects Linux's origins as a server and development platform. Different environments require different tools, and Linux is designed to adapt rather than enforce a single way of working. This flexibility can be liberating, but it also means there is no single Linux experience, which can confuse newcomers. Linux also thinks differently about performance and resource usage. Windows and Mac OS often prioritize smooth animations, visual effects, and background services that enhance user experience but consume resources. Linux, especially in its lighter configurations, values efficiency. It can run on older hardware, embedded devices, and massive servers with equal reliability. This efficiency is not accidental. Linux was designed to scale from tiny systems to supercomputers. As a result, it avoids unnecessary abstractions and prefers tools that do one thing well rather than many things imperfectly. The open-source nature of Linux is perhaps the most important factor in how it thinks. Windows and Mac OS are controlled by corporations with commercial goals. Their design decisions are influenced by marketing, user retention, and ecosystem lock-in. Linux, while supported by companies, is fundamentally community-driven. Decisions are debated openly, code is reviewed publicly, and improvements are made by people who use the system daily. This leads to a culture where functionality and correctness often matter more than appearance. Bugs are not hidden. They are documented. Limitations are discussed rather than masked. This transparency shapes how Linux behaves and how users interact with it. Documentation is another subtle but telling difference. Windows and Mac OS aim to be self-explanatory. If something is not obvious, it is often considered a design flaw. Linux assumes that reading documentation is part of using the system. Man pages, configuration files, and community forums are integral to the experience. This does not mean Linux is intentionally unfriendly. It means it treats computing as a craft rather than a product. Learning is expected, and mastery is rewarded with greater control and efficiency. Linux also encourages automation and scripting in a way that Windows and Mac OS historically have not emphasized to the same degree. While all modern operating systems support scripting, Linux is built around the idea that repetitive tasks should be automated. Command line tools are designed to work together, passing output from one to another. This composability reflects a belief that users should build their own workflows rather than rely solely on graphical interfaces. For power users, this is incredibly empowering. For beginners, it can feel alien. Even error handling reveals philosophical differences. Windows and Mac OS often present errors in simplified, sometimes vague messages to avoid overwhelming users. Linux tends to be more direct. Error messages may be cryptic, but they are usually precise. They tell you what failed and why, assuming you have the knowledge or willingness to investigate further. This honesty can be frustrating at first, but it aligns with Linux's belief in transparency over comfort. Another important aspect is how Linux views backward compatibility. Windows goes to great lengths to ensure old software continues to work, sometimes at the cost of architectural cleanliness. Mac OS supports older applications but is more willing to break compatibility when it aligns with Apple's long-term goals. Linux takes a pragmatic approach. While it values stability, it also values progress. If something is fundamentally flawed, it may be replaced, even if that requires users to adapt. This willingness to evolve reflects a mindset that prioritizes technical integrity over convenience. Linux also differs in how it defines success. For Windows and Mac OS, success is measured in market share, user satisfaction surveys, and revenue. For Linux, success is measured in reliability, adaptability, and adoption in critical systems. Linux runs the majority of servers, powers Android devices, and dominates supercomputing. Its desktop market share may be smaller, but its impact is enormous. This context explains many design choices that seem strange from a purely consumer perspective. Linux is not trying to win by being the easiest. It is trying to be the most capable. The learning curve of Linux is often criticized, but it is more accurate to say that Linux front-loads understanding. Windows and Mac OS hide complexity until something goes wrong, at which point users are often helpless. Linux exposes complexity early, encouraging users to build mental models of how the system works. Once those models are formed, Linux often becomes more predictable and less frustrating than its counterparts. What feels like difficulty is often simply unfamiliarity with a different way of thinking. Linux's relationship with hardware further illustrates its philosophy. Windows relies heavily on vendor-provided drivers, and macOS supports only a limited set of hardware that Apple controls. Linux aims for broad compatibility through open drivers and community support. This approach is slower and sometimes less polished, but it reduces dependence on vendors. Linux prefers openness and long-term maintainability over short-term convenience. Community support is also central to Linux's identity. Instead of official customer support channels, Linux relies on forums, mailing lists, and collaborative problem-solving. This fosters a culture of sharing knowledge rather than consuming support. Users are encouraged to understand problems deeply and help others do the same. This communal mindset is very different from the consumer support relationship seen in proprietary operating systems. Ultimately, Linux thinks differently because it was born in a different environment, for different users with different goals. It values control over simplicity, transparency over polish, and flexibility over uniformity. It assumes that users are capable of learning and making informed decisions. This does not make Linux inherently better or worse than Windows or macOS. It makes it different. For those willing to adopt its mindset, Linux can feel empowering and logical. For those who expect it to behave like a consumer product, it can feel hostile and confusing. Understanding Linux is less about memorizing commands and more about shifting perspective. Instead of asking what the system is doing for you, Linux invites you to ask what you want the system to do and how you want it to do it. That single shift in thinking explains most of the differences people experience. Linux is not trying to protect you from the machine. It is inviting you to work with it.